Some mountain ranges did not go quiet at night. They simply changed what the silence was for. In this episode, there were 9 case files from the Appalachian Mountains, each assembled from partial records, search and rescue logs, ranger journals, trail camera data, county registries, and emergency call summaries. The details did not always agree. The pattern did. If you want more archived case files like these, subscribe to Black Pine Archives and stay to the end. One of these stories left a physical artifact behind that should not have existed yet. Mallory Quinn received the alert the way she received most of them, as a neat block of data that pretended the wilderness could be organized. A personal locator beacon had registered as active in a high ridge zone where the trail turned from dirt to stone, and where wet lichen made footing unreliable even for experienced hikers. The coordinates sat close enough to a marked route to suggest a simple misstep, but the elevation and the slope angle suggested the kind of recovery that went wrong when daylight ran out. She opened the incident template, pulled the forecast, and read it like a warning label. Light wind, low cloud, intermittent mist, no lightning. Temperatures that would not kill quickly, but would drain strength and judgment if someone was immobile. She checked the last cell pings within the coverage map and got the usual answer for that corridor: partial, inconsistent, not reliable. The beacon was the one true signal in a landscape that swallowed signals. Mallory built her team with the same disciplined bias she always used. One experienced tracker, one medical lead, one technical specialist to run the receiver and confirm bearing, one liaison to coordinate with county resources if a hoist or a drone was needed. She requested a helicopter stand by because procedure demanded it, and because she had learned to never trust a ridge after the sun dropped behind it. The team staged at a pullout while darkness still pressed into the valley. Headlamps made small cones of light that felt inadequate against the mass of trees. Radios stayed low, not for secrecy, but because nobody wanted to hear their own voices echoing in the wet air. Mallory's tech checked the receiver, confirmed the beacon identifier, and read out the distance estimate as if it were a normal number. They moved at first light. The climb was slow and careful. Wet leaf litter turned to slick rock. Small streams crossed the route, narrow enough to step over but deep enough in places to take a boot if someone misjudged the bank. The ridgeline above them looked like a spine, dark and uneven against the washed gray sky. Every few minutes the tech rechecked the receiver. The distance count should have dropped in smooth increments, the way a person's breathing changed when a climb got steeper. The device did not behave that way. It held steady, then collapsed. Beacon reads 0 meters. From SAR field report, Mallory had seen odd readings before. Multipath reflections, weak signals bouncing off cliff faces, devices confused by topography. But a reading of 0 meant the receiver believed they were standing on the beacon. The team paused, scanned the ground, and did what trained people did when the world gave them the wrong answer. They verified the coordinates again. The unit insisted they were exactly where they needed to be. The problem was that the where was a solid rock face. It rose from the slope like an old wall, a slab of stone that looked too smooth to be natural from a distance, then revealed its roughness up close. There were seams, small fissures, and darker pockets where water had run for decades. But there was no opening, no cave mouth, no crevice large enough to swallow a person with a beacon in their pocket. The receiver stayed pinned at 0, as if the beacon sat just behind the stone, as if the mountain had agreed to hold a signal the way a pocket held a coin. Mallory ordered a grid search around the base. Boots scuffed damp soil. Gloved hands moved branches. The tracker looked for crushed grass, torn leaves, broken twigs, anything that suggested a fall or a scramble. A ranger tapped the rock with a trekking pole, listening for a change in tone that might suggest hollow space. Another team member raised a handheld thermal unit and swept it slowly along seams, looking for heat that did not belong. The surface gave them nothing they could call a rescue route. It gave them only a detail that changed the atmosphere of the team in a way Mallory recognized instantly. Fewer jokes, more silence, eyes moving faster. Fresh scratches ran across the stone at shoulder height, gouged in parallel lines. Not a single scrape, a set as if something had been dragged sideways with repeated contact. The marks were new enough that the raw stone beneath looked pale and wet, not yet darkened by the mountain's usual staining. Mallory took photographs with a measuring tape in frame. She measured the height from the ground to the lowest scratch. She noted the spacing between lines. She documented the way the marks angled slightly upward as they traveled toward a seam, as if the thing that made them had tried to climb. The first voice they had from the incident did not come from the missing person. It came from the emergency summary attached to the activation, a weak call that had preceded the beacon by minutes, logged as incomplete and difficult to parse. Caller insists target is in rock. From emergency call summary, Mallory did not like that line. It was too specific, too impossible. It was the kind of thing people said when they were rational and terrified. At the same time, trying to make sense of something that refused to be made sensible. By mid-morning, she added a technical element. A county engineer arrived with a portable scanner used for detecting voids behind rock and concrete, normally for culverts and damaged retaining walls. It was not designed for mountain slabs, but it could rule out the simplest explanation, a cavity close behind the face. The engineer ran the scanner across the area of strongest signal. He repeated the sweep at different angles. He checked the calibration twice. The readout did not show a void. No cavity detected. From technical measurement log that should have ended the theory that the beacon was inside the rock, it did not end anything. The beacon kept transmitting steady and patient, like a heartbeat that refused to admit the body was missing. Mallory had the team step back and run bearing checks from a few positions along the slope. The receiver pointed them toward the same face every time. The signal did not weaken with small shifts. It did not flutter as if it were reflecting. It behaved like a beacon sitting in open air, except open air did not exist where the receiver insisted it did. The escalation came the way it often came in real cases, through small procedural anomalies that gathered into a shape nobody wanted to name. The helicopter crew flew the ridge and reported no visual sign of a person, no bright fabric, no reflective flash, no movement. The dogs refused to track past a certain point on the slope. They circled and whined near the rock face, then pulled away as if the ground near the stone carried a smell that did not fit into their training. A volunteer who stepped close to the seam described pressure in the ears, the way altitude changed without warning, except they had not gained enough elevation for it. Audible tone anomaly noted near face. From radio traffic transcription, Mallory heard it too, faint and intermittent, more a sensation than a sound at first. A thin tone, almost like the edge of radio feedback, that seemed to rise when a person faced the seam and fall when they turned away. It did not come through the handheld radio. It seemed to exist in the air itself, tight against the stone. She ordered the team to mark the perimeter and avoid unnecessary exposure. She rotated personnel away from the face in intervals, partly to manage fatigue, partly because something about the seam felt like it wanted attention. Mallory had learned that when terrain behaved wrong, people behaved wrong too. They leaned in. They took risks. They tried to prove they were not afraid. She kept the operation anchored to process. Documentation, safety lines, timed check-ins, controlled movement. She wrote down the details that could be verified and let the rest live only in her eyes and her throat. By late afternoon, fog drifted in and out. The rock face looked different each time the mist shifted, as if depth changed with the moisture. The beacon signal remained stable. Then, near evening, the receiver did something it had not done all day. It shifted its 0 point, not by feet, not by meters, by geometry. The text stood in the same spot, and the display still read 0, but the bearing now pointed to a different section of stone a short distance away. The team moved to follow, assuming drift or error. When they reached the new indicated point, the receiver again read 0, and the old area lost prominence, as if the beacon had migrated inside the mountain without traveling through the open world. Mallory ordered a halt. She watched the team's faces. She watched hands tighten on straps. She watched people try to turn fear into curiosity. She took more photographs. She recorded the receiver screen with timestamps. She captured the shift as a series of images so it could not later be dismissed as a memory glitch. She marked both 0 locations with bright tape on nearby branches, not because tape could stop anything, but because humans needed fixed points when the environment stopped being fixed. When the team withdrew at dusk, the beacon continued to transmit. Mallory left no one alone on the slope. She did not allow lingering. She did not permit one last look. Back at staging, she filed the report the way she had been trained to file reports. She did not write what she thought. She wrote what she could prove. The photo of the receiver reading 0 against a solid rock face, the measured scratch marks, the void scan results, the call summary, the dog behavior, the helicopter negative, the tone noted in radio traffic. Beacon reads 0 meters. From SAR field report, no cavity detected. From technical measurement log in the evidence section, she listed the physical artifacts that existed as documentation. Photographs of the receiver display, photographs of the scratch marks with scale, the technical scan logs, and a diagram of the 2 0 points along the stone. That night, after the team was released, Mallory replayed the last fragment of the emergency call audio. The caller's voice was thin, as if speaking while moving, and the words were incomplete. But one sentence was clear enough to survive static. My beacon is on. It says I'm here. From partial emergency audio. The next morning, when the team returned, the beacon signal was still active. The receiver still read 0 at the rock face. The scratch marks were unchanged. The seam looked darker, as if dampness had gathered along it. The tape markers were still tied where Mallory had placed them, but a new set of shallow gouges had appeared, above the first scratches, higher by a hand's breadth, as if something had climbed again in the night, dragging itself across stone and leaving proof only where it could not be erased. Mallory documented those marks too. She requested additional resources. She kept the operation open. The beacon kept transmitting, and the mountain kept answering with the same impossible number. Archival transition. In the archive, the beacon file was initially sorted under equipment errors due to the 0 meters anomaly. It was reopened after later cases began repeating a separate detail, the same minute appearing in unrelated logs, as if the mountains were not only holding people, but holding time. Ranger Isaiah Mercer wrote everything down because paper did not glitch, and because memory, under fatigue, could be edited without permission. His journals were not poetic, they were practical. Time stamps, weather, trail conditions, wildlife activity, maintenance notes, and the small human problems that became large ones when darkness and terrain got involved. He treated routine as protection. If something changed, the record would show when it started. The entry that mattered came from a night patrol during a mild stretch of the season, when the forest should have been loud with its usual machinery. The air should have carried insects. The canopy should have clicked and shifted. The creek that ran alongside the patrol corridor should have talked the whole way down the slope. At 3:17 in the morning, Isaiah wrote, "The forest dropped. Silence interval 7 minutes." From Ranger Journal, He did not describe it as simple quiet. Quiet still had texture. Quiet still had distant water, small wind, leaf movement, the soft hiss that microphones always caught, even when humans believed nothing was happening. This was different. This was subtraction. Isaiah stopped walking because his body did not know how to walk without the background. The sense of motion felt wrong, like stepping through a photograph. He took his hat off to check for ringing, then pressed his fingers briefly into his ears and released, listening for the natural rush that proved his hearing still worked. He looked down at the creek and watched it. The water moved, but the sound did not. He checked his radio and heard only a stable, empty channel, not even the faint static that lived in electronics. He tapped the handset against his palm and listened again. It remained blank in a way that felt intentional rather than broken. Isaiah recorded a voice memo on his phone, partly out of habit and partly out of fear that he would later try to convince himself nothing happened. His voice sounded too loud in the open air. Everything is off, even the stream. From voice memo later entered into the file. During the 7 minutes, he tested the world the way a technician tested a circuit. He shifted his weight and listened for gravel under boot. Nothing. He brushed his sleeve against his jacket and listened for fabric. Nothing. He exhaled through his nose, then through his mouth, and listened for breath in the cold. He could feel air in his lungs, but the sound of it did not exist. He swept his headlamp across the understory. A moth hung in the beam at shoulder height, wings open, not fluttering. It did not look dead. It looked paused. Isaiah watched it for several seconds, and the insect did not drift, as if gravity and air resistance had both been asked to wait. His watch face glowed. Time continued to advance. The second hand moved. At 3:24, sound returned with the abruptness of a switch thrown. The creek resumed first, but it did not sound like it had sounded before the drop. The flow carried as if it had shifted to a slightly different bed for those 7 minutes, then returned a fraction out of place. The insects resumed in a wave. The canopy released a delayed rustle. Isaiah heard his own breathing again, and the relief made him lightheaded. He walked out of the corridor and filed his report as if he were reporting a fallen tree. He used restrained language. He avoided conclusions. He wrote the time window, the duration, and the environmental observations. He attached the voice memo. He expected an internal shrug and a note to check his equipment. Instead, 2 weeks later, dispatch began receiving calls from hikers describing the same event. It was never a full night. It was never random. It was always 7 minutes. People used different words but returned to the same sensation. Their bodies felt confused without ambient sound, as if silence was not an absence but a pressure. Multiple hikers report same time. From emergency call overview at first, the Park Service treated it like pattern chasing, the way people did when a rumor traveled faster than a ranger could correct it. The corridor was popular. Information moved. A single odd entry in a journal could become a legend by the time it reached the trailhead bulletin board. Then the archive received something that did not contain opinion at all. A maintenance contractor pulled audio from a trail camera posted near the same route. The unit was installed for wildlife monitoring and occasional vandalism deterrence. The video was unremarkable. Infrared trees, empty trail, no human silhouettes. The audio track, however, carried a measurable anomaly that made the staff stop using the word rumor. An audio engineer volunteered to analyze it and produced a short summary that read like a lab result, not a story. Audio shows flat noise floor. From analysis summary, nature did not produce a flat noise floor. Even in windless conditions, there was micro noise, distant water, insects, the movement of air across microphone membranes, the faint electronic hiss of the device itself. This file did not show reduced sound. It showed a sudden, clean drop into near zero, held for 7 minutes, then returned as abruptly as if someone had reconnected the world. Isaiah requested permission to stake the area through the time window with redundant recorders. He wanted different devices, different batteries, different microphones, different power sources. He wanted to eliminate the comforting explanation that a single piece of equipment had failed. He returned with a battery-powered field recorder, a spare phone, and a body-worn camera borrowed from a neighboring agency. He placed them at staggered distances along the corridor, each one time-synced as closely as possible. He kept one on his chest so there could be no argument about placement. He sat where the creak was loudest, because if anything should have stayed audible, it would have been water moving downhill. At 3:17, all devices recorded the same gap. Not only did the forest go silent, the electronics did too. The microphones did not pick up their normal internal noise. The recorders behaved as if they were inside an engineered acoustic chamber rather than a living mountain corridor. Event correlated across devices. From Ranger Addendum, Isaiah did what he could inside the event, because it felt like a test and he did not want to fail it. He tapped a metal carabiner against a rock. The impact should have clicked sharply and echoed. The sensation traveled up his wrist, but the sound did not exist. He snapped his fingers once, then twice, watching the motion like a person watching their own hands, for proof they were still connected to reality. He later wrote that the silence did not feel empty, it felt occupied. After the 7 minutes ended, Isaiah did a slow perimeter check. He looked for signs of other hikers, prank setups, hidden speakers, anything that suggested human interference. He found no footprints that did not belong. He found no trash. He found no fresh-cut branches, no disturbed soil, no places where someone could have stood without leaving evidence. He did find one small thing that counted as a physical artifact and made the file harder to dismiss. At shoulder height, tied to a branch near the creek, a strip of flagging tape fluttered in the returning wind. Flagging tape was common. Rangers used it, SAR used it, contractors used it. The difference was the knot. It was not a standard bow. It was not a square knot. It was a compact wrap with an extra turn that cinched tight in a way Isaiah's crew did not teach. It looked like a knot designed to hold even if someone pulled hard, then released suddenly. Unidentified knot pattern noted. From maintenance note, Isaiah photographed it with scale and location markers. He logged it as an unexplained trailside marker. He bagged the tape as evidence because it was the first object that suggested the silence was not just a passive condition. Something had been present long enough to tie a knot and deliberate enough to place it at human shoulder height. In the case file, the ladder of evidence built itself without theatrics. The ranger's journal entry, the voice memo, the multi-caller emergency summaries, the trail camera audio artifact, the independent analysis, the multi-device verification, the photographed knot, and its chain of custody notes. Silence interval 7 minutes. From Ranger Journal, audio shows flat noise floor. From analysis summary, in the weeks that followed, the corridor gained an unofficial rule among staff who worked nights. Do not stand alone near the creek at 3:17. Not because they believed in ghosts, but because the verified evidence suggested something else, something colder. The silence was not the wilderness going to sleep. It was the wilderness being muted, and whoever controlled the mute button seemed to prefer that humans stayed still while it happened. Archival transition. Within the same week, the 7-minute drop was verified across devices. An off-trail hiker reported a structure that did not exist on any map, and the county registry confirmed there was no record to contradict him. Jonah Pike was not reckless. He was the kind of hiker who kept his phone in airplane mode to save battery, who carried a cheap paper map as a backup, and who told friends his route even when it felt unnecessary. His mistake was the kind that happened in every park, every season, to people who believed efficiency was the same as safety. He cut a trail corner by roughly 30 meters to bypass a muddy section where a fallen branch forced a wide detour. The main trail was visible through the trees, or at least it felt visible in the way a path felt close when the forest was open and the slope was gentle. Jonah expected to rejoin it within a minute. Instead, he stepped into a shallow bowl between ridgelines where the air felt heavier and still, as if the wind could not reach the depression. The trees grew tighter there, trunks close enough that the space between them looked measured. The ground was oddly clean of underbrush. There were no briars, no young saplings, none of the usual clutter that forced careful footing. It did not look like a natural clearing. It looked like a corridor maintained without tools. Jonah later tried to explain the sensation with practical words. He described it as stepping into a place that had been kept ready. He noticed the quiet first, not the normal hush of shade, but a lack of small movement. Leaves hung without twitching. The insects that had bothered him along the muddy turn did not follow him into the bowl. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and mineral stone, like an old cellar that had never been opened. Then he saw the house. It stood back from the slope on bare earth, squared and plain. The walls were dark wood without paint. The roofline looked low, not because the structure was small, but because it seemed pressed down by something above it. There were no windows, not boarded windows, not broken windows. Nothing cut into the walls at all. The surface was uninterrupted like a box. The entrance was the strangest feature. There was a door-shaped outline, but the threshold sat high, roughly at chest level, as if whoever built it assumed the approaching body would be taller than a person, or that the approach would be made from something that rose up to meet it. Beneath the door, the wall was solid, offering no step, no platform, no porch. Jonah stood staring at the geometry of it, feeling his mind search for an explanation that could not be found. Structure observed off-trail. From Ranger Incident Report, he raised his phone and took a photograph, then another. His hands shook more from confusion than fear. The screen showed an image that looked wrong immediately. Not the clear outline his eyes insisted he was seeing, but a rectangle of shadow between trees. The camera acted as if it could not decide what it was looking at. Jonah took a third picture and stepped sideways to change the angle. The result was the same. The house remained present to his vision and absent in any meaningful detail on the device. Jonah did not approach the door. He did not touch the wood. He took one careful step backward, then another, keeping his eyes on the structure the way a person watched an animal they did not trust to stay still. He turned his head only long enough to find the direction he had come from. The corridor did not lead back to the trail. The trees were too uniform. The clean ground offered no scuffed footprints to follow, no bent grass, no broken leaves. Jonah walked in what he believed was a straight line, then adjusted to match the slope, then adjusted again when the ridge angle felt wrong. In a normal forest, the body corrected itself using countless small clues. In the bowl, those clues were missing or misleading. The place felt designed to interrupt orientation. After some time that Jonah later could not quantify with certainty, he tried to use his phone's compass. The needle drifted, then steadied in a direction that did not match the sun's position above the canopy. He tried again. The compass spun briefly, then locked as if it had chosen a lie and committed to it. His breathing grew loud. Sweat soaked through his shirt despite the cool shade. He drank water and immediately felt thirst again, as if hydration did not register properly in his body. The farther he moved from the house, the more the air felt resistant, like pushing through damp fabric. When Jonah finally managed to place an emergency call, the signal was weak and came in bursts, but it connected long enough for dispatch to log a coherent pattern. The operator noted disorientation consistent with panic and environmental stress. The call also included one detail repeated with stubborn certainty. Jonah had seen a house where there should be nothing. Hiker found disoriented. From emergency dispatch summary, by the time ranger staff located him near dusk, Jonah was sitting against a tree and staring at his own boots as if he did not fully trust them to exist. His pupils tracked movement too slowly. His hands trembled when he tried to drink. He did not appear hypothermic. He was sweating and warm to the touch, but his speech carried the flat, careful rhythm of someone trying not to break. His statement was simple and persistent. He described the windowless walls. He described the door at chest level. He described the way his phone refused to capture the structure properly. He described the clean ground and the corridor feeling. He described trying to walk out and finding no trail. A ranger wrote the incident report in the neutral language used for claims that could not be verified at the scene. Jonah's photographs were attached as supporting material, though they offered little more than dark shapes. Because procedure existed for exactly this kind of claim, the Park Service asked the county registry to check property records for any homestead, shed, hunting cabin, or abandoned structure within the area Jonah described. The coordinates were approximate, but his route and timing narrowed the search. The registry returned nothing, no property record. From county registry check. The next day, a ranger returned to the bowl using Jonah's route and the attached map notes. The forest was normal again in ways that felt unsettling. Underbrush had returned. The corridor effect was less obvious, as if it had never been maintained. The air moved. Insects resumed. The bowl looked like every other depression between ridges. There was no house. There was no foundation. No cut stumps. No cleared earth. No discarded lumber. No sign of equipment access. The ground showed no compressed soil where a structure should have stood. The ranger widened the search, moving slowly, not because he expected to find anything, but because the job required it. He looked for the only thing that might remain if Jonah's perception had been altered by stress. An anchor, a physical detail that could not be dismissed as imagination. He found a bent nail driven into a tree at shoulder height. On that nail hung a strip of fabric, snagged and fluttering weakly. The cloth looked like denim, torn cleanly, with threads stretched at one edge as if it had been pulled hard. It was the kind of fragment that came from clothing, from a pant leg or a jacket hem, torn when someone moved quickly past a sharp point. The ranger bagged it as evidence and tagged it with location and time, because it was the first object in the area that did not belong. Cloth fragment recovered from nail. From evidence tag, the escalation in the file did not come from something dramatic. It came from a small failure of documentation. The ranger attempted to photograph the nail and the fabric in place before removal. The first image came out blurred, as if the camera could not focus on the exact point where the fabric met the nail. The second image showed the nail clearly, bark texture sharp, metal head visible. The fabric was not in the frame. He lowered the phone. The fabric was still there in front of his eyes, still fluttering, still snagged. He raised the phone again and took a third image. The fabric appeared as a faint smear, like motion blur, despite the air being nearly still. He wrote a supplemental note that avoided interpretation and described only what could be verified. Inconsistent photographic capture of the cloth artifact at the point of recovery. Photographic inconsistency reported. From Ranger's supplemental note. Later, back at the station, the evidence bag held the fabric exactly as expected. It photographed normally under indoor lighting. The nail, once removed, photographed normally as well. The inconsistency existed only at the site. The case file built its evidence ladder without needing language about the supernatural. Witness statement, Ranger incident report, county registry check, physical artifact recovery with chain of custody, and the supplemental documentation describing device inconsistency. Jonah's original photos remained in the file as a reminder that the first record had failed to capture what the witness insisted was present. In the archive, the story was categorized as a disorientation incident with an unverified structure report. It might have stayed there if the fabric had not matched a missing person report, filed weeks later for a different hiker, miles away, who had last been seen wearing denim with a distinctive stitched seam. The seam was not enough to prove anything on its own, but it was enough to make the next ranger who read the file wonder whether the house had been real and whether the place had simply chosen when it wanted to be seen. Structure observed off trail. From Ranger Incident Report Archival Transition. Some places did not resist being seen. Others resisted being recorded. The next file began with a device that recorded nothing but black for 9 hours, and yet still captured what moved around it. The trail camera belonged to a private landowner named Everett Shaw, a man who treated his boundary lines like an extension of his spine. He allowed limited passage along a narrow corridor where the public trail skirted his property, mostly because the alternative route was steep enough to turn ankles. He did not like surprises, he did not like strangers, and he liked the trail camera most of all because it turned movement into proof. The unit was standard, infrared night mode, motion-triggered recording, time-stamped clips, a small microphone, and a memory card swapped every few weeks. Everett checked it the way a person checked locks, not out of fear, out of habit. The anomaly began with a battery drain. He noticed the battery percentage dropping faster than it should have, even for a damp season when cold nights ate power. He replaced the cells, tightened the housing, and checked the strap. The camera kept draining. He assumed it was a faulty batch and made a note to change brands. Then he pulled the card. What he found was not subtle. For roughly 9 hours, every motion-triggered clip was pure black. Not dark woods, not underexposed shadows. Black like the lens had been covered by a hand or pressed into fabric. The timestamps continued. The camera continued to trigger. The file sizes were normal. The unit behaved as if it were recording a night full of movement. But the video frames contained nothing but a void. Video blackout 9 hours. From camera log, Everett's first instinct was practical. Cameras failed in common ways. Spiders built webs that turned infrared into glare. Leaves pressed against housings. Moisture fogged lenses. He drove out at midday, expecting to find an obvious reason, the kind that made you feel foolish for worrying. The housing was clean, no spiderweb, no leaf, no mud smear, no oily residue, no condensation inside the lens cover. The infrared array lit properly in test mode. The lens was clear. The internal diagnostics, when he checked them, showed no error codes. The unit was functioning the way it had been designed to function, which made the blackout harder to dismiss. He called a local technician who serviced security systems for cabins and small businesses, the kind of person who had opened enough housings to recognize tampering. The technician removed the camera, opened it on the tailgate, inspected the seal, the lens, the sensor, and the array. He found nothing that would explain a total blackout across multiple clips. No infrared obstruction visible. From technical inspection, the only usable data was the audio. And the audio was not blank. The microphone had recorded the woods in its normal way at first. Distant insects, occasional wind, the small hiss of electronics. Then, at irregular intervals, something moved close to the camera. Not close in the way a deer wandered past. Close in the way a face leaned in. Breathing filled the microphone, slow and measured, loud enough to suggest a mouth near the housing. It did not sound like someone out of breath from a hike. It sounded like someone testing the boundary between the camera and the world. exhaling to see what the device could still register when its eyes were gone. Then came footsteps in leaf litter, circling, stopping, circling again. The cadence suggested deliberate pacing, as if whatever stood there was walking around the camera like an animal inspecting a trap. Breathing at mic. From audio analysis, Node Everett did not take the card to social media. He did not send it to friends. He brought it to the nearest ranger station because the simplest explanation was also the most dangerous one. A person had been on his land at night, close enough to breathe into his camera. The rangers treated it first as a potential poaching incident. Chain of custody was documented. The card was sealed in an evidence envelope, labeled and imaged. Copies were made for analysis so the original could remain untouched. A park technician ran the files through a basic integrity check and confirmed that the blackout appeared in the original stream itself, not as a later edit. Because digital evidence was easy to dispute, the rangers requested an independent review from a lab that had previously assisted with wildlife camera vandalism cases. The second analyst confirmed the same conclusion. The blackout was native to the files. There was no signature consistent with common consumer editing tools. The camera had recorded black frames while continuing to capture audio normally. Original file integrity verified. From independent review, the investigation should have ended there, filed under equipment anomaly with suspicious audio. It did not, because the rangers returned to the site. They approached the tree where the camera had been mounted and saw the first detail that changed the case from strange to patterned. The bark around the strap carried faint scuffs as if something had slid along the trunk repeatedly. The scuffs formed a rough horizontal band at the same height as the camera, a shoulder-level abrasion that looked too even to be accidental. It was not a claw mark. It was not a bear rub. It resembled repeated contact by something with a broad edge, a shoulder or an arm, moving side to side against the bark. It echoed the shoulder-height scratches documented in the beacon case, not in shape, but in placement, as if the same invisible measurement had been used. Bark abrasion band noted at sensor height. From Ranger Field Note. The ranger team photographed the band with a scale marker, measured the height from the ground, and checked nearby trees. 2 more trunks within a short radius showed similar abrasion at nearly the same level, faint but present, as if the camera tree had been the center of attention and the surrounding trees had been brushed during circling passes. They remounted the camera, replaced the strap, and installed a new memory card. They added a second unit farther down the trail, angled back toward the first to catch any approach. Both cameras were tested on site. Both recorded normally in daylight. That night, the footage returned to normal. Deer passed in infrared, eyes bright, bodies moving through the corridor as if nothing had ever gone wrong. A raccoon climbed the tree and sniffed the housing, paws leaving small prints on bark. Wind moved branches. The audio captured the ordinary texture of the woods. The rangers began to believe the blackout had been a one-time tampering event that had ended when attention arrived. Then the timestamp reached 3:17 in the morning. The audio dropped for 7 minutes, not just quieter, not a wind lull, not a microphone failure, a clean fall into near zero, matching the flat noise floor anomaly verified in Ranger Isaiah Mercer's file. The video continued to record. The infrared continued to show trees and empty trail, but the sound vanished in a way that made technology and environment behave like the same system. At 3:24, the audio returned abruptly, and for a moment before the normal forest noise fully re-established itself, the microphone picked up a single close inhale, as if something had remained near the housing the entire time, waiting for the world to switch back on. Correlated silence interval detected. From audio comparison memo, when analysts overlaid the 2 cases, they found alignment not only in duration, but in the character of the drop. The silence was too clean. It removed even the electronic hiss that microphones typically carried when the world was quiet. It was not only the forest that went silent, it was the recording environment itself, as if the space around the camera had been temporarily sealed. The second camera, the one aimed toward the first, did not provide a clear answer. Its night clips showed the corridor empty. Its audio dropped at the same 7-minute window. Its battery drained at an accelerated rate during the blackout interval, then stabilized after, a detail logged because the technicians were now looking for anything that could be measured. Everett's original card remained the physical artifact that anchored the case. The evidence ladder built itself in the file: landowner observation of abnormal battery drain, camera log of blackout, technical inspection ruling out obstruction, SD card preserved under chain of custody, independent integrity review confirming native blackout, ranger field notes documenting abrasion at sensor height, and cross-case audio correlation with the verified 7-minute silence event. Physical artifact logged the original memory card containing the 9-hour blackout and the close proximity breathing audio. In the archive, the case was not filed under wildlife. It was filed under corridor anomalies, a category that did not officially exist until enough unrelated reports forced someone to invent it. Because once a device proved it could be blinded without being touched, responders began leaning on older methods. If the woods could take a camera's eyes, then the next step was to mark the trail in a way the woods could not easily edit. The next case began with tape, rope, and a line placed at the exact height where a human throat became a liability. Archival transition. When devices failed, responders leaned on the oldest methods: tape, rope, and visible markers. The next file began with a line on a trail placed at the exact height where a human throat turned into a liability. The first report came from 2 hikers who did not call it what it was at first. They called it something strung up, the way people softened words when they did not want to admit how close they had come to being hurt. They were a couple from out of county, day hikers with clean boots and a printed trail map folded into neat squares. They had started late and were moving fast, trying to beat dusk back to the lot before the temperature fell. They were the kind of hikers who believed danger announced itself. The rope did not. It waited in a narrow section where the trail threaded between 2 trees that grew close enough to feel like a doorway. The corridor funneled their attention forward down to the dirt, toward the next step. The rope was level and tight, strung at neck height for an average adult, the color of old hemp that blended into bark and shadow until it caught the last thin light. One of them ducked on instinct because the other made a sudden sound that turned his head upward. The rope brushed the underside of her jaw with a pressure that felt gentle only because she had not hit it at speed. She stumbled, caught herself, and kept her balance by grabbing a branch that tore at her glove. Later, in the emergency intake notes, the near miss was reduced to a single procedural line, but the bruise did not read like procedure. Near miss reported, contact at jawline. From emergency summary, a ranger reached the site within the hour. Approaching in the careful way responders approached any scene that looked like it had been built. His name was Dana Hargrove, and he had been on enough calls to know the difference between clutter and intention. He found the rope exactly where the hikers described it, pulled tight across the trail, not sagging, not frayed, and not accidental. 2 trees served as anchors, the line wrapped and secured with competent knots. The tension suggested someone had leaned their full weight into it while tying, the kind of pull that usually left scuffed heels, crushed leaves, disturbed soil. Dana looked down, expecting to see evidence of a body doing work. The ground looked untouched. The soil was soft enough to hold prints. The duff layer showed no disruption beyond the hiker's own tracks and the ranger's approach. No kneeling marks, no drag marks, No scattered leaf litter from someone pacing while measuring height. The rope was present, but the installation footprint was absent, as if the line had appeared fully formed. Improvised line across trail. From ranger report along the rope, fabric strips were tied at uniform intervals. Each strip hung like a small flag, a consistent rhythm of cloth and knot and cloth again. The spacing was too even to be casual. The materials looked repurposed, torn from shirts and bandanas and maybe a flannel sleeve, old fabric with faded colors. But the repetition gave it a different flavor than vandalism. It resembled a corridor marker system, a line you were meant to follow with your eyes once you noticed it, a guide that also happened to be placed where your throat would meet it first. Fabric spacing uniform. From photo documentation, Dana treated it as malicious human behavior because that was the sane category. He photographed the knots, measured the height from the trail bed, documented the distances between fabric strips, and radioed for a second unit to sweep nearby for camps or fresh tire tracks. The assumption was simple. Someone had set a trap for outsiders or a warning for locals. Something cruel, something personal. The sweep found nothing that fit. No recent campfire ring, no discarded food, no beer cans, no cut branches where someone cleared a working space, no boot prints leading off trail toward the anchor trees. The woods in that area usually held evidence the way damp clay held ruts. Here, it held none. No installation tracks observed. From scene protocol, the rope was removed carefully, not cut at first, but loosened in a way that preserved the knot structure. Dana bagged the line and each fabric strip separately, labeled them, and noted the exact location with a GPS reading and a trail description. The evidence chain was clean because a clean chain was all that separated a file from a campfire story. The case should have ended as an isolated incident. It did not. 2 days later, a second rope was found deeper on a lesser-used spur that branched off the main trail and looped toward an old service corridor. The placement was the same. The height was the same. The tension was the same. The fabric strips were spaced with the same unnerving precision. This time, the first person to see it was a maintenance volunteer who walked slow, scanning for washouts and fallen limbs. He stopped before the rope reached him, but his report included a detail that shifted the case from human to patterned. The knot at the anchor looked familiar in a way he could not name. It was sent to Dana's team, who compared the knot photographs to prior files. One of the fabric ties matched an unidentified knot pattern documented during the 7-minute silence corridor case. The match was not perfect in every loop, but the structure was distinct enough to make the ranger's notes go quiet. Knot pattern consistent with prior unknown. From ranger comparison note, the escalation moved through procedure rather than drama. The second rope was removed and logged. A segment of fabric was cut with the knot intact and placed in a separate evidence pouch for lab analysis. The intent was to find something physical that could point to origin: fiber composition, soil residue, pollen load, micro debris that could indicate whether the cloth had come from a local home, a thrift store, a vehicle, a campsite. Fabric sample retained with knot intact. From evidence inventory, the lab results were inconclusive in the ordinary ways and unsettling in one specific way. The fiber blend was common. The dirt matched local soils. The fabric carried pollen, heavy and clinging, as if it had been exposed to a dense bloom. The pollen profile, however, skewed toward a plant that did not bloom during that season in that elevation band. The lab did not claim impossibility. It noted inconsistency. It suggested mislabeling, contamination, transport. It offered plausible options the way labs always did, because labs were not in the business of saying a forest had moved time around. But in the file, the inconsistency sat like a second rope, taut, level, waiting at throat height. Pollen profile seasonally inconsistent. From Lab Addendum, Dana returned to the spur corridor on the following evening, with 2 other rangers and a set of tools that felt suddenly inadequate: headlamps, measuring tape, flagging, and radios. They walked the segment where the second rope had been, scanning for anything that could explain how a line could be placed without leaving a body's pressure on the ground. They found a third sign, smaller than the ropes but more personal. On a tree near the trail edge, at the same shoulder-to-neck height, a faint abrasion band marked the bark, like something had been pressed against it repeatedly. It echoed the camera abrasion from the boundary corridor and the shoulder-height scratches from the Beacon Rock face case, not as a single signature but as a repeating measurement, as if the system that placed these things did not need hands, only a consistent idea of where a human's vulnerable line lived. The case file captured the evidence ladder in the language that could survive scrutiny: witness report and near-miss summary, ranger photographs and measurements, scene protocol documenting lack of installation tracks, cross-case knot comparison, lab addendum noting seasonal inconsistency, physical artifact logged, rope segment and the cut fabric knot preserved intact. No one wrote the sentence that hovered under all the pages. The ropes did not feel like traps set to kill. They felt like markers set to teach. The ropes were removed each time they appeared, but the pattern did not stop. The corridor learned that responders would follow visible danger. It learned that hikers would talk. It learned that a throat-height line forced human attention upward, and once attention was trained, it could be redirected. Archival transition: some traps used rope, others used air. The next file centered on a mine entrance where the oxygen looked normal. The carbon monoxide stayed low, and yet bodies failed, as if the rules of breathing had been rewritten. The mine was not on public tours. It was a documented old shaft on private land, sealed years earlier with a metal grate and a warning placard that had faded into something closer to decoration than deterrent. Locals still called it by the name of a company that no longer existed. Teenagers still found ways in. So did adults who believed the danger was mostly myth and rust. On a damp afternoon in early fall, 2 adults went in far enough to regret it. Their names in the file were Lila Bram and Warren Keats. They were not thrill-seekers in the usual sense. They were the kind of people who treated abandoned places like puzzles and assumed that caution and flashlights turned risk into adventure. They parked at a pull-off and walked the last stretch through wet grass, following a faint path that looked like it had been used recently, not by hikers, but by people who returned to the same spot over and over. The grate at the entrance had been bent at one corner, just enough for a person to slip through sideways. That detail mattered later, because it suggested persistence, not a one-time break, a maintained access point. Inside, the mine swallowed light fast. Water dripped steadily in the dark, and the air carried the cold, mineral scent of stone that never saw sun. The first 100 yards were easy enough. Uneven ground, scattered timbers, old cable fragments half buried in silt. The walls glittered faintly when their headlamps moved, a dull metallic shimmer that made the space feel larger than it was. The first sign that something was wrong was not the meters, because they did not have meters. It was language. Lila later described a moment when she tried to say a simple sentence and felt the words break apart before they reached her mouth, as if her tongue had forgotten its job. It began as a joke between them, a clumsy mispronunciation blamed on cold air. Then it became an effort, a slow stumble of thought. The second sign was the smell. It came in a soft wave, sweet in a way that did not belong underground, like candy left too long in heat, like syrup warmed on a stove, like something artificially pleasant designed to make a human inhale deeper. Warren's headlamp beam shook as he lifted a hand to his mouth, not coughing, not choking, but reacting to the wrongness of sweetness in an old shaft. He tried to turn back. His legs did not cooperate. The emergency call, placed from inside the mine on a thin slice of signal that should not have existed, captured the moment where fear became procedural because the body failed faster than the mind could argue. Sweet odor, sudden weakness. From responder report, the dispatcher heard breathing that sounded heavy and careful, as if each inhale had to be chosen. Lila's voice came through in short fragments, not panicked at first, but confused in a way that sounded like intoxication without the warmth. Warren did not speak much. His contribution to the call was a series of strained exhalations and a few words that slurred together then stopped. The log noted that the caller reported legs giving out and a sensation of the air changing. The phrase that stood out was the one Lila repeated twice, like she needed it to be believed. The air felt light, not thin, not lacking oxygen. Light, as if it had lost the weight that lungs expected, and the body could not reconcile the difference. The file later classified it under disorientation, but the responders used a different word in private, a word that came up again after other cases: unreal. A volunteer rescue squad arrived within the hour. The team was not large, but it was trained in the kind of discipline that mattered in confined spaces: redundancy, clean comms, minimal time in the hazard, and strict thresholds for when to turn back. They brought meters because meters were the line between caution and guessing. The first readings came back normal where they mattered. Oxygen within expected range, carbon monoxide low, no obvious explosive gases, no red flags that would justify immediate withdrawal under standard protocol. The meters insisted the air was safe. Oxygen normal, carbon monoxide low. From measurement log, the team entered anyway with the tension that came from a mismatch between instruments and instinct. Their headlamps cut through blackness in clean cones. Their boots made soft sucking sounds in damp silt. The air felt cool and stable near the entrance, but deeper in, the smell appeared again, faint at first, then more present, like sweetness hidden behind stone. They found Lila and Warren where the tunnel narrowed, not collapsed, not trapped, but unable to move in any meaningful way. Lila was upright against the wall, eyes wide, lips parted as if she had been trying to talk for too long. Warren lay on his side with one knee bent, a position that looked like rest until his hands tried to push and failed. Neither showed obvious injury, no blood, no twisted joints, no rockfall. The problem was the way their bodies refused simple commands. A rescuer later described it as if gravity had increased in increments, pinning joints and thickening movement. Another described it as if the muscles had lost the concept of lifting. Subject unable to stand reports heavy limbs. From extraction note, the team did not debate theories in the shaft. They did what confined space teams did when the human body stopped obeying itself. They secured harnesses, kept the victims' heads elevated, and ran a controlled drag toward the entrance with a second line ready if anyone else went down. One rescuer kept a hand near the wall, not for balance but for orientation, because the tunnel began to feel subtly wrong in scale, like the distance to the entrance changed each time he looked away and looked back. A body-worn camera captured parts of the extraction. Later review noted something that did not belong. The audio quality shifted as the team passed a specific section of wall, and for several seconds the microphones captured less than their own breath should have produced, a soft flattening of background noise that echoed the 7-minute corridor phenomenon in miniature. The effect did not last long enough to be categorized as the same event, but it was long enough to make the camera audio feel edited by reality. The team reached the bent grate and pulled both victims through. Outside, air hit them like a physical thing. Warren vomited immediately, not blood, not bile heavy, just a sudden purge of whatever his body had been trying to reject. Lila began crying without sound for several seconds, then sobbed hard enough to bruise her own ribs. Neither could explain the sensation in a way that fit poison or panic. They could only repeat the words they had been able to hold on to. The air turned too light. Rescue extracted 2 persons. From emergency dispatch record, in the hours that followed, responders did what they always did. When meters read normal but bodies acted abnormal, they treated for exposure, they checked vitals, they sent the victims for evaluation, they documented, they tried to find an ordinary cause hiding inside a strange presentation: solvent exposure, mold, an unmeasured gas, chemical runoff, a pocket of something heavier or sweeter than the instruments could detect. Then the team went back for one more thing. A dust sample was collected from the mine wall where Lila had pointed before her legs failed, the section where the sweet odor felt strongest. The responder who took it used a clean scoop and a sealed bag, labeled with date, time, location, and chain of custody initials. The dust looked unremarkable, gray grit with a faint metallic shimmer that could have been mica or some common mineral. But when the bag was sealed, the responder noted that the sweetness lingered on his glove longer than it should have, as if the smell clung. Dust sample secured from wall. From evidence tag, the lab work began with basic screening. Nothing dramatic, nothing definitive. The report did not claim a toxin. It did not name a substance. It did not give the satisfaction of an answer. It did identify faint organic traces where inert mineral dust should have dominated. The phrasing was cautious. The confidence was low. The recommendation was procedural. Keep the sample sealed in secondary containment until a better analysis could be run. Organic trace indicated source undetermined. From lab prelim that should have stayed inside a single file. It did not, because the mine case began to echo earlier patterns in small ways that made the archive feel less like a collection and more like a map. The odor was sweet, like something meant to be inhaled. The weakness was sudden, like a rule switched. The meters read normal, like the environment wanted to pass inspection, and the access point, bent and maintained, suggested that the mountain did not rely on chance for entry. It relied on repeat visitors. It relied on curiosity. It relied on the human tendency to treat warnings as decoration. Evidence ladder recorded in the case file. Witness symptom report. Emergency call summary. Gas meter logs. Extraction protocol and body cam review. Evidence tag and chain of custody. Lab preliminary. Physical artifact logged. Sealed dust sample bag from the mine wall. No one wrote in the public-facing summary that the victims both reported the same final detail before their legs failed, a detail too subjective to stand as evidence and too consistent to ignore. They both felt for a moment that breathing became optional, not because the air was missing, because something in the mine had changed what breathing meant. Archival transition. When the mountain did not use air, it used warmth. The next file took place in a locked cabin where the stove was already warm, boots were wet, and the snow outside held no approach and no departure. The cabin existed because Appalachia had a habit of turning small mistakes into long nights. It was one of several winter shelters maintained under a local keyholder program, the kind built to keep people from freezing when the weather slipped faster than forecasts. Volunteers checked the structure on a rotating schedule, logged every visit, swept out rodents, replaced emergency blankets, and made sure the stove and chimney were safe enough that a desperate person would not burn the place down trying to stay alive. The cabin was supposed to be locked and unused that week. Denise Rowe, the assigned keyholder, had signed the maintenance log 2 days earlier and marked the site secure. She had done this long enough to make the paperwork feel like ritual. The stove damper was closed. The ash bucket was emptied. The emergency kit was intact. The door latch caught clean. The padlock sat straight. On the evening the file began. A hunter driving a ridge road called in a report of smoke seen at dusk, thin and pale against the trees. It looked like chimney smoke, not a wildfire, which made it both less urgent and more unsettling. In that part of the mountains, chimney smoke meant people. The patrol team that responded was small. 2 rangers in a marked unit with a body-worn camera policy and a habit of writing everything down. They approached slowly, expecting trespassers, a forgotten fire, or a chimney backdraft that made the cabin look occupied when it was not. They parked far enough away that their tires would not ruin whatever tracks might exist, then walked the last stretch on foot, with headlamps low. The first detail that caught them was the door. The cabin door was locked. The padlock was not cut. The hasp was not bent. The latch showed no fresh scratches. The windows were intact, their glass dark, reflecting only the ranger's lights and the black shape of trees. The roofline looked normal. No glow in the curtains because the cabin had no curtains. No movement in the window because there was no window light. They used a master key, the way the program required when a locked shelter became a potential safety incident. The door opened with the familiar dry sound of old wood shifting in the cold. The first breath of air that rolled out of the cabin carried 2 things at once: warmth and ash. The stove radiated heat as if it had been fed recently, not the faint residual warmth of a structure that held daytime sun, but active warmth that pushed against skin. The iron was not glowing, but it was warm enough that a hand held close could feel it without touching. Stove warm upon entry. From Ranger report, the firebox held a small pile of burnt wood, collapsed into fresh ash the way logs did when the last flame died minutes earlier, rather than hours. The smell was sharp and clean, not stale, as if the smoke had not had time to settle into the walls. A thin ribbon of heat still rose inside the stove when one ranger opened the draft a fraction, then shut it again in the same cautious motion used around live fire. Near the door, a pair of boots stood upright on the plank floor. They were positioned the way someone left them when stepping out of them quickly, toes forward, heels slightly apart, laces loosened. The boots were wet enough that water beaded and ran in slow lines onto the floorboards. The wetness was clean. It did not look like mud. It did not carry grit. It looked like snowmelt, the kind that came from walking through deep snow and then standing in warm air until ice turned to water. Wet boots staged near entry. From scene notes, that detail pulled the Rangers into procedure. If the stove was warm and the boots were wet, someone had been inside. If someone had been inside, there should have been tracks outside, because the last storm had laid a clean surface of snow across the clearing. They backed out and closed the door behind them to preserve the interior, then began the perimeter check the way they were trained. The snow around the cabin was undisturbed. No footprints approached the door. No footprints left it. No drag marks. No scuffs where someone might have circled the building. Even the area beneath the eaves, where snow sometimes melted unevenly, held an unbroken crust. They widened the search radius and photographed what the scene gave them: empty whiteness, the cabin sitting like an object placed on a table, and the absolute lack of human approach. No tracks in perimeter. From Photolog, they checked the chimney next, expecting to find the explanation there. An ember that smoldered from an old maintenance burn, a bird nest that ignited, a chimney draft that made the roofline look like smoke when it was only fog and breath. The chimney cap was cold to the touch. The surrounding snow on the roof showed no fresh disturbance. There were no ladder marks, no boot prints on the slope. They returned inside and did the slow inventory. The emergency kit was present and sealed. The firewood stack by the stove was not disturbed. The kettle on the shelf was empty and cold. The logbook sat in its usual place. They opened it. Denise's last entry was there, written in a steady hand. Date, time, condition of supplies, lock, secure. There was nothing after it. No scribbled note, no added signature, no scratched out line that suggested someone had hesitated and decided against writing their name. Cabin log shows no entry. From protocol addendum, they treated the boots as evidence without touching them directly. One ranger photographed them from multiple angles, including the tread pattern and the brand stamp on the inner tongue. The other took temperature readings the way responders sometimes did when time mattered and bodies were missing. Air temperature inside the cabin, surface temperature on the stove, temperature near the boots. The stove read warm. The air read warmer than it should have in a closed cabin on a winter night. The boots read cold at the toes and slightly warmer at the ankles, as if the wet had been melting for a short time, not long enough to warm the leather fully. A rational explanation tried to take shape. Someone had been there, built a fire, then left before the rangers arrived. That scenario collapsed the moment they looked again at the snow outside. There was no way to leave without leaving a story on the ground. They called Denise next, because the program required it and because names were easier than mysteries. Denise answered, and her response was recorded in the incident file as a formal statement. Keyholder denies visit. From statement, she denied being at the cabin. She denied lending her key. She denied making any fire. She told them exactly what she had done on her last visit and exactly what she had not done. She offered to drive out immediately to prove she was not lying, but the rangers told her to stay put and let the process do what it was designed to do. The process, in this case, meant collecting what could be collected. One wet lace was removed carefully from the nearer boot, cut cleanly at the knot so the knot remained intact. It was sealed in an evidence bag, labeled and logged. A small ash sample was taken from the stove firebox with a sterile scoop and stored separately because ash could hold information: type of wood, presence of accelerant, traces of paper or fabric. The damper position was recorded. The stove door latch was checked for fingerprints, though the cold and age of the metal made that effort more ritual than science. Wet lace segment retained, ash sample secured. From evidence inventory, the rangers then did the only thing they could do that might reconcile the lack of tracks. They checked the possibility of entry from above. They inspected the roofline interior, looking for signs that someone had dropped through a hatch or a vent. The cabin had no hatch. The rafters were intact. The dust on the upper beams was undisturbed, thick enough to show a brushed handprint if one existed. There was none. They checked the back wall for a broken plank, a loose window frame, anything that suggested a body could enter and leave without touching snow. The cabin had no back entrance. The wood was solid. The interior was simple. The cabin was designed to be secure because supplies disappeared otherwise. As the scene refused to offer an ordinary answer, the rangers did what professionals did when a case became a file instead of an incident. They made the file heavier. They pulled the body-worn camera footage and reviewed it in real time, then in slow playback, listening not just for voices but for the noises that came when humans did things. The scrape of a boot, the clink of a zipper, the clatter of a dropped flashlight, the thin hiss of air through a cracked door. At first, the footage showed what they remembered: the master key, the door opening, the stove heat, the boots, the careful movements through the room. Then, under the obvious sounds, something else began to appear. It was faint enough that it could have been dismissed as equipment artifact if it had not repeated with the same spacing each time it emerged. 3 taps. A pause. 3 taps. The pattern rode beneath their own footsteps like a second layer of audio. Not loud, not dramatic, but consistent in the way a signal was consistent. Faint tapping pattern detected on audio. 3 strikes, pause, 3 strikes. From later review, once the Rangers heard it, they could not unhear it. It appeared most clearly at the moment the door first opened, as if the sound had been waiting for an entry event. It appeared again near the stove, softer, as if it belonged to the cabin itself rather than the world outside. It did not align with their movements. It did not match the timing of their own hand motions. It had its own pace. The patrol reported the audio finding up the chain, and the file was forwarded to a supervisor who had seen enough unrelated incidents to recognize a pattern without naming it out loud. The cabin case was cross-referenced to earlier reports that included the same 3-and-3 rhythm, the same uneasy sense that certain places responded to human attention the way a system responded to input. The response again was procedural. The cabin was secured. The boots were left in place after evidence collection to avoid contaminating the scene further. The stove was allowed to cool naturally. The lock was replaced with a fresh numbered seal that would show tampering. Denise was instructed not to return until a formal follow-up inspection could be scheduled. The follow-up happened 3 days later under clear daylight. 2 rangers, Denise, and a county maintenance volunteer approached together, all wearing the kind of expressions people wore when they expected to feel foolish. The seal was intact. The lock showed no tamper marks. Inside, the cabin was cold. The stove was cold. The boots were still there, upright, exactly where they had been left. The floor beneath them was dry. There was no new water, no new ash, no new smell. The only difference was the lace. The cut lace end on the boot was clean and frayed where it had been removed. Denise stared at it longer than anyone else because she knew the simple truth. If the boots belonged to a person, then the person had left without their boots. If the boots did not belong to a person, then the cabin had staged them like a prop. Denise signed the log with shaking hands, not because she was afraid of paperwork, but because signing felt like agreeing that reality had stayed stable. Her final note in the logbook became one of the few first-person lines that survived the editing process of official reports. I locked this cabin. I did not light a fire. I do not know whose boots these are. From keyholder log entry, the evidence ladder recorded in the case file remained stubbornly clean. Ranger report of stove warmth, scene notes on wet boots, photo log confirming no tracks, keyholder statement and log entry, protocol addendum on the missing log entries, body cam audio review identifying a consistent tapping pattern. The physical artifact logged was small and ordinary, which made it worse. A wet lace segment sealed and labeled, carrying the scent of wood smoke when it should have carried only snowmelt. In the archive, the cabin case was classified under unauthorized shelter use with anomalous scene conditions, a category used when a place looked occupied without evidence of entry. It sat beside other files that shared a theme, environments that passed basic inspection, scenes that looked staged for discovery, and signals that repeated as if the mountain had learned a rhythm. And the cabin did one last thing that made the Rangers stop speaking for a moment. When the supervisor listened to the original body-worn audio through headphones, he noticed the taps were not quite random in timing. The pause between the sets aligned within a narrow margin to a minute marker, not a full minute, a minute that seemed to sit slightly wrong against the rest of the recording, as if the clock inside the file had hesitated and then resumed. The archive did not label it as time drift. It did not label it as interference. It did not label it as anything at all. It simply stored it, because the next file would force time into the evidence in a way no one could file as sound or warmth or missing tracks. A receipt dated tomorrow, inside a pack found today. Archival transition. The cabin file was initially classified as unauthorized shelter use, the kind of incident that usually ended with a citation and an apology. It was reclassified only after the audio review flagged the same 3-and-3 tapping pattern found in earlier reports, and after the snow photos confirmed an entry with no approach. In the archive index, the next folder was already waiting under a different category: recovered property with a date that had not happened yet. The backpack was found in a place where hikers usually stopped without thinking. The stream crossing was shallow, but the stones were slick, and people often set their packs down to tighten straps, swap socks, or check a map before climbing toward the ridge. This pack was not tossed aside or snagged on brush. It was upright against a boulder, squared to the water, positioned like a marker meant to be seen from the trail. The ranger who discovered it, Elena Birch, did not touch it barehanded. She photographed first, then marked the ground around it with small flags, the way she had been trained, because abandoned gear in the backcountry was not just lost property. It was a timeline. It was a clue. Sometimes it was bait. Inside, the contents looked ordinary enough to lower the pulse before raising it again. A rain shell folded too neatly for panic, a cheap headlamp with a cracked lens, 2 granola wrappers, a half-full water bottle, a spare battery pack. Everything damp in the way the mountains made things damp, but not soaked, not swollen, not ruined. The zipper seams held their shape. The paper items inside should have been soft if they had sat in wet air for long. There was a zip bag in the front pocket. In it sat a receipt, printed clean and sharp on bright thermal paper. The ink dark and unbroken like it had been made minutes earlier, not carried through mist and creek spray. The station name was familiar, a small local gas stop at the edge of town, where hikers bought coffee and jerky before driving up. The date at the top was wrong. It was dated tomorrow. Receipt date ahead. From evidence protocol, Elena did what responders did when something looked impossible. She tried to break it into smaller pieces that could be proven or disproven. She checked the pack for a wallet or an ID. She found a name inside a dry sleeve: Zachary Lott, age in his early 20s, day hiker, local college student, last known plan to do a short out and back to a popular overlook. His name matched a missing person call from the previous afternoon. That timeline was backed by a parking lot camera that caught him stepping away from his car, and by a friend's message thread that ended after sunset. Missing hiker last seen yesterday afternoon. From emergency summary, a receipt from tomorrow did not fit any of it. Elena called the station using the number on the receipt. The manager answered with the flat patience of someone who had dealt with weather outages and drunk customers and occasional theft. He checked his register settings first, because he assumed the same explanation Elena wanted: clock error. He confirmed the date and time on his system matched the real world. He pulled the register report for the item list on the receipt. The transaction did not exist. Transaction not found in store log. From follow-up note, Elena asked him to confirm something else. Some stations rotated paper rolls. Some used different printers at different tills. The manager verified the receipt format matched their standard template. The font, the spacing, the line breaks were consistent. If the printer had produced it, it had produced it as itself. He could not explain why his system had no record of the sale. Elena returned to the stream crossing and treated the site like a quiet scene. She photographed the pack again, focused on details that told time. The dampness pattern on fabric, the way the straps held water, the softness of the ground around it. There were no footprints around the pack except hers and the second ranger's, both clear in wet soil. No scuffs that suggested someone placed it down and stepped away. No drag marks, no knee prints. The pack had arrived without leaving the usual human signature. No prints observed within the immediate radius. From scene notes, the thermal paper was the next problem. Thermal receipts normally degraded fast. Heat, moisture, friction, sunlight, all of it turned the ink faint. This one was crisp. The edges were clean and square, not curled. It looked freshly torn from a printer, then sealed away immediately. And yet the zip bag it sat in was not airtight enough to keep thermal ink pristine for long in mountain humidity. Paper not weathered. From scene inspection by late afternoon, the response shifted from fieldwork to procedure. The pack and receipt were logged together, sealed as a single evidence package to preserve context. Chain of custody forms were filled out. The receipt was photographed front and back with a scale marker. The timestamp and item list were transcribed. Every detail that could be attacked later by skepticism was fixed into documentation now, ink sharp, stock consistent with thermal paper. From evidence inventory, the county lab confirmed what everyone expected and still disliked hearing. The paper stock was modern. The ink response was consistent with current thermal printing. No visible sign of manual alteration. No stamp overlay, no pen correction. It was not a forged receipt in the traditional sense. It was a normal receipt with one abnormal field. The date. Ink recent, paper modern. From lab note. The escalation did not come as a monster in the trees. It came as a second file opened quietly 2 weeks later in a neighboring district. Another abandoned pack. Another receipt. Same phenomenon. Tomorrow's date, crisp print, a list of items that included an old brand of trail mix. The station had stopped carrying months ago. In the cross-reference, an analyst noted the detail that linked it to everything else in the archive, without needing to say the word connection. The receipts were wrong by a day. The earlier cases were wrong by minutes. Second anomalous receipt logged. From case cross-reference, Elena documented one more detail before she closed her section of the report. The receipt did not just say tomorrow. It also printed a time that fell inside the verified silence window, the one that Ranger Isaiah Mercer had recorded, the one that flattened audio down to almost nothing. The receipt timestamp sat in that missing sound like a needle in a gap. She did not write a theory. She wrote the alignment. Timestamp overlaps reported silence interval. From supplemental comparison note, evidence ladder recorded in the case file. Witness discovery and scene photos. Evidence protocol and chain of custody. Store follow-up and register verification. Scene inspection of paper condition. Lab note on ink and stock. Cross-reference to second anomalous receipt. Physical artifact logged. Backpack and receipt sealed as a single evidence package, with photo documentation and lab handling record. Archival transition. The archive treated the receipts as clerical anomalies until the next file forced a different question. If time could print ahead and sound could vanish for 7 minutes, then what else could shift without leaving the marks people relied on? The final case began with footprints to a cliff edge, the oldest pattern in the mountains, and then broke that pattern by the call came in mid-morning on a day that looked harmless from town. A cold front had moved through overnight, leaving the ridgelines clean and bright, the kind of clarity that made people overconfident. The missing subject was not a reckless teenager or a seasoned climber. He was a weekend hiker named Landon Shaw, late 20s, local address, no known medical issues, last seen stepping onto a spur trail that led to an overlook popular for sunrise photos. The first part of the response followed routine. Rangers checked the trailhead log, confirmed his vehicle, pulled the last cell ping, and assigned a sweep pattern that pushed teams from both sides of the ridge to meet near the cliff corridor. The ground below the overlook held wet mud from the previous night's melt, perfect for tracks and perfect for mistakes. The team found the prints sooner than expected. They were clear, deep, and confident. Standard boot tread, medium size, consistent stride length. They led in a straight line toward the cliff edge, the exact kind of geometry that made experienced responders tighten their pack straps without speaking. Then the prints reached the lip. They did not scatter. They did not angle away. They did not end. They continued. On the vertical face of the rock at roughly shoulder height, a partial tread impression sat in the stone as if pressed into wet clay. Another appeared higher, another higher still. The spacing was wrong for a fall and wrong for a stumble. It was the spacing of steps. Prints on vertical face. From Ranger report, Rangers did what they always did before letting the mind name what the eyes wanted to call impossible. They tested for ordinary explanations. One ranger leaned over at a safe angle and checked whether there was a hidden ledge below the lip that could have held a boot and transferred mud upward through awkward movement. The rock face offered no shelf. It was clean drop, sheer enough that even loose gravel refused to sit on it. A technical lead documented the next check. Rope marks. If someone had panicked, tried to self-rescue, or been pulled by a companion, the stone should have shown abrasion lines. Nylon left signatures, so did hemp, so did wire. The inspection found nothing. No scuffed rock, no scraped bark at the rim, no snapped brush that indicated someone had anchored and hauled. No rope marks. From inspection log, they expanded the search in the direction procedure demanded, not the direction curiosity wanted. Teams moved downslope to look for a body, gear, blood, anything consistent with a fall. Nothing surfaced. No jacket caught in branches, no broken poles, no disturbed leaf litter. The slope below the cliff held old debris and stone, but nothing fresh enough to belong to Landon. Above, the prints kept climbing. The mud impressions were not smeared. They were not streaks. They were distinct stamps, incomplete at the heel in some places, full at the toe in others, the kind of detail that suggested weight transfer. A person shifting balance, a foot lifting, a foot placing again. To avoid putting a responder at risk on the edge, the incident commander authorized a drone launch. The drone was a standard county unit used for canyon searches, stabilized camera, distance markers, and real-time feedback to the command tablet. It hovered along the rock face and filmed the sequence of prints upward in a loose line that angled slightly toward a seam in the stone. The video removed the last comfortable doubt. The impressions were not on a hidden shelf. They were on the face itself. The drone camera caught sunlight raking across the rock, showing the texture change where mud had been pressed into micro pits of stone. Drone confirms pattern. From video documentation, because the evidence could not be collected, documentation became the artifact. A ranger held a measuring stick on an extension pole close to the face for scale while the drone recorded. Another photographed from multiple angles to show the cliff lip and the vertical plane in the same frame. They logged the coordinates, the height of the lowest print from the base, and the estimated vertical distance between impressions. Photographs captured with scale reference. From evidence memo, the escalation came quietly, in the way details did when a team had stared long enough to see beyond the obvious. Under several of the prints, faint parallel scratches ran across the rock at a matching height. The gouges were not deep, but they were new enough that the stone beneath looked lighter. The pattern resembled brush marks from other cases, except these were not soft sweeps in mud. These were linear cuts in stone. One ranger noted the similarity without assigning cause. The report language stayed clinical. Parallel scratch marks associated with prints. From comparison note, the team widened the scan above the print line to search for any place a person could have exited. A top-out ledge, a crack, a trail, even a fallen tree that could have served as a bridge. The drone found none. The prints rose until the rock face curved under an overhang. Beyond that point, the camera could not see without risking signal loss. A second drone pass attempted a different angle. The feed stuttered once, then stabilized. The prints were visible again, and then something else was visible with them. Not a person, not a shadow, but a clean absence. A section of rock where the surface looked slightly too uniform, as if the texture had been blurred or smoothed. The drone's focus hunted, unable to lock. The drone operator wrote the simplest description possible. Autofocus instability noted near overhang. From drone operator notes, as daylight moved, the mud impressions began to change. Not because mud dried, because the surface around them seemed to shed the marks the way a road shed tire tracks after a grader passed. A faint sheen formed over some prints, like condensation in reverse, and the tread detail softened at the edges. A ranger documented it as environmental degradation, but the timeline was wrong. Thermal conditions did not shift that fast. Wind did not blow that hard on a protected face. A body cam recorded the moment one of the responders noticed the shift and stopped moving. It looks like it's fading while we watch. From body cam audio, the search continued until procedure thresholds forced the decision everyone hated. Weather moved in earlier than forecast. The wind on the ridge increased. The team leader called the cutoff before darkness could turn the cliff into a second emergency. They did not write the word impossible. They wrote the words that allowed the report to exist in a system built for normal accidents. No sign of the subject, no gear recovered, no evidence of rope use, pattern documented, drone footage archived, family notified, search suspended pending conditions, outcome classified as missing, presumed accident. From case closure summary, the archive kept the photographs and the drone video as primary evidence because they were the only thing that behaved like proof. The rock face could not be bagged. The cliff could not be moved into a lab. The prints could only be held as images, time-stamped, scaled, and copied into a file that would sit beside 8 others that shared a similar habit of breaking rules without leaving the kind of debris investigators relied on. Evidence ladder recorded in the case file, ranger report, inspection log, drone video confirmation, photographic evidence with scale, cross-case comparison note, closure summary, physical artifact logged, photographic set of vertical prints with scale, plus original drone video file, archived as primary evidence. Final archive note 9 case files, 9 different entry points into the same pattern, that the mountains could decide when a path existed, when sound existed, when time stayed aligned, and when evidence could be erased without being removed. If one of these cases stayed with you, tell us which file felt the most plausible and which felt the most wrong. Subscribe to Black Pine Archives if you want the next set of archived reports, because the pattern in these 9 did not end here.